The last month or two, we've been talking about prayer. We've looked at why it's important, at how it changes us and the world around us, and at various different types of prayer. And that's all great, really, it is. But for me, it's also been a tough series to preach on. And to understand why, I'm going to have to give a little bit of context, a little of my story, I guess. Most of you probably know that I was an atheist up until the age of 10. Now, obviously, as an atheist, I didn't have a prayer life, but I was also very depressed. And I was very good at hiding it. To the point where people, including even my parents, would say that one of my great strengths was the ability to be happy regardless of circumstances. And that's how I wanted it. I didn't want to burden anyone else, especially those closest to me. So I faked it. That might be part of why I developed into a decent poker player. But it was eventually something that I would have to spend years unlearning as well. Now, when I was 10, I became a monotheist. And just before turning 11, I became a Christian. In those early years, I prayed a lot. Now, mostly these prayers were confession or thanksgiving, or something scripted like the Lord's Prayer, or perhaps a part of the liturgy. But I didn't feel anything from them. And I was still depressed. And this all changed 2 weeks before my 15th birthday. It was the last night of a missions trip that I was on during a foot washing service. The leaders went around to each person, laid hands on them, and prayed for them. And for the very first time, I felt the presence of God. I don't remember what they prayed. But what I vividly remember was that from that moment on, things looked different. It was a real scales falling from my eyes sort of moment. In spite of the fact that I had been depressed for as long as I could remember, I had never actually put that word to it. You see, rather than assuming something was wrong with my brain, I just assumed that that's how the world was. And when that was lifted, in spite of all my study, I still don't have words for what that was like. I mean, the world was still the same, but everything was different. And my prayer life was different. Prayer was no longer something I did at assigned times or by assigned forms. I sent up hundreds of tiny prayers a day for strength, for guidance, for thanksgiving, for confession and lament, or just to feel God's presence. And when I ran out of words, but still felt driven to pray, I simply spoke in words that I didn't understand, but lifted up to our Father anyways, trusting that He would know what to do with them. Prayer and meditation were easy, joyful, and they filled me in a way that I cannot express. And for 2 decades, that was how I prayed. Like breathing, it was natural, almost unthinking to do, even painful to stop for too long. And even through the worst times in my life, the death of my younger brother, the murder of my best friend, when Rachel and I lost the baby, even then I had God, my comfort, my refuge, my strength. The world could be hard and cruel at times, but if God is for me, then I know that all of that is temporary. And so for 2 decades, I lived with my feet on the earth and heaven on my mind. Until last year. You see, at the beginning of 2020, I stopped feeling God's presence. I kept praying, but I stopped hearing a reply. What had felt like an intimate chat with a loved one started to feel instead like shouting down a dark tunnel, believing there was someone on the other side, but hearing no response. Now, I'd had short periods like this before, days, even weeks at a time, the odd month here or there, but those were easy to weather by comparison. Just keep praying, push through, and soon enough, this too shall pass. So I kept praying through spring and then through summer, although it became harder as the months went on. And in the fall, I realized my depression had returned. In a way, it's not unusual, right? I mean, the pandemic hasn't really been good for anybody's mental health, as far as I'm aware. And there's been more depression, more anxiety, more divorce. Suicides have roughly doubled. This isn't a healthy environment. So it probably shouldn't come as a surprise. But it was. I mean, my healing was a big part of my faith story. It was the memory that I clung to when everything else was falling apart, that reminded me that no matter what else was happening, God could do miracles. God was there for me. God wanted a relationship with me. And that was taken away. And I have no idea why. How am I supposed to pray from there? It's a terrible thing to cast your voice into the darkness and hear only an echo in response. Even more terrible is to cast your voice out and to fear what response you might receive. Because, like Job's comforters, I kept asking, did I do this? Did I push away God's Spirit? Was I proud or greedy or slothful? Did I do something I shouldn't or fail to do what I should? Did I just not have enough faith? I kept asking those questions, and I keep getting no answer. And so this series on prayer has been a difficult one for me as a preacher. That first sermon that I gave in this series was on why prayer is important, because I do believe, I know that it is. But this second sermon is on what I feel is the only honest sermon that I can give right now. How do we pray from the darkness? And I'm going to tell you up front, I wish I had more compelling answers, because honestly, I could really use them right now myself. But then again, I don't want to be like Job's comforters either, offering empty platitudes and quick fixes. All I can do really is share where I'm at, what I read in the scriptures, and admit that I don't have all the answers here. Heck, I'm not even convinced there are answers to be had. These periods of spiritual darkness are part of being human, and there might be nothing we can do to hurry them along. There are things in life that simply must be endured. And maybe these are just one of those things. When our Lord spoke to his disciples in Gethsemane, he told them that he was deeply grieved, even to the point of death. Even Jesus was not spared these times of spiritual darkness, of feeling distant from the Father. Even he would cry out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So if we want to know how to pray from beneath the shadow, there's no better place to start than in that garden. When Jesus knelt in prayer, he said, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." He pleads with the Father to be brought out of this time of grief, of darkness and distress. He wants it gone, and he makes that very clear. But ultimately, he submits to what is happening and to what is to come. "If this cannot pass until I drink it, your will be done," he says in the second and third prayers. It honestly floors me that in this moment, Jesus did not seem to know if what was happening was truly necessary. "If it's possible, let it pass from me. If it cannot pass until I drink it, your will be done." A part of his suffering, of his feeling separation from the Father, seems to have been to have that hidden from him. And in a lot of ways, that makes it more relatable, doesn't it? We don't get to know why our periods of spiritual darkness happen. It's part of the nature of those times that we can't sense any higher purpose to what we're going through. At least that's how it's been for me. And the example that Jesus sets for us during those times of grief and doubt is to make our desires known to God, but to say ultimately, your will be done. And that sucks. I mean, it's the right thing to say. Of course it is. But in that moment, in that darkness, those are the hardest words to pray that I can imagine. And when I'm in that wounded and vulnerable state, 9 times out of 9, I don't have the strength to pray those words. At least to pray those words and mean it. I fall short. I'm a broken record, stuck repeating over and over again the first half of Jesus's prayer. Let this pass. O Lord, let it pass. And I kind of have to think that that's okay. Because my answer to how do we pray from the darkness is however we can. Imperfect though we are, the important thing is to keep showing up. That may not be satisfactory. Heck, I know that isn't satisfactory. But it's what I've got. Well, that and one other thing. If you are in that dark place, if you're stuck praying for that cup to pass along, I'm right here with you. You may sit in darkness, but you do not sit alone. And if the cup is bitter, at least we'll drink together. I'd like to close by reading Psalm 130 one more time and taking a few minutes to pray on it or meditate on it, or if you prefer, to pray something else. Because again, the important thing is to keep showing up. And afterwards, we'll have a few minutes for questions. Psalm 130. Out of the depths, I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, Lord, who could stand? But there is forgiveness with you, so that you may be revered. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than those who watch for the morning. More than those who watch for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is great power to redeem. It is he who will redeem Israel from all its iniquities. So do people have questions?
Hey, Chris, thanks for that. First of all, thanks for your vulnerability there and sharing your heart with us. And I really appreciate that. So I guess my question is when you're going through this dark spot, and you probably said this in your sermon, but just maybe expound on it a little bit more, is like, what keeps you coming back when you're not hearing anything from God, when you're not feeling anything from God? Because I operate off of feelings a lot, and it's kind of a thing. So I'm curious as to how you deal with that when you're not hearing or feeling from God.
Well, I think there's a long tradition, especially in the Old Testament, of remembering. Uh, and for me, the knowledge of what I've been through, the memory of what God has done for me in the past, that's what keeps me coming back.
And I suppose also to know that this isn't an unusual or unique thing for yourself. Like there's a litany of saints that have gone through this darkness of the soul sort of thing, or their spiritual, wandering in the desert, and they've come through it on the other side. And I suppose that's something that you can take great comfort in also.
Yeah.
I have a question, Chris. I know we've talked kind of at length, but I kind of want to hear, I think other people might appreciate hearing, how do you handle, because I know we've, in terms of like prayers for healing, those prayers aren't always answered, and we know that, we're supposed to trust God and trust that those will be answered. So instead of not just feeling God's response, how do you handle, and or would have others handle, having prayers go unanswered?
Well, that is a very tough one. And I guess the only answer I have at the moment is I keep showing up. I keep praying, I keep knocking. Jesus told some parables about that. And so I keep coming back.
I don't really have a comment either, but I wanted to thank you for your transparency as well. I have been thinking about some people that I know who have stepped away from church, and some of the things that they've talked about are not knowing what to do when that darkness hits, because we have this persistent, we have to be happy, we have to be happy thing. And I think willingness from people that we see in leadership positions in churches, acknowledging that this does happen and that you don't have to have all of the answers, is something that's really powerful. So I just wanted to sort of commend you for getting up and being so vulnerable about it.
Thank you.
Chris, this is Brett. I do want to thank you for your vulnerability. I think it's important to talk about this stuff. I think it's real, and I think the extent to which we gloss over it is a disservice. As Emily was just saying. I guess I've taken a couple things from 12-step groups that I find helpful. One is just what you said, which is bring the body and the mind will follow. But when people are struggling to find sobriety, that's what they're told to do, is keep coming back. And the other thing that I've learned in that context that I think is really helpful to me is when I'm feeling, and this can be a tool for a lot of different things, but when I'm feeling resentful and can't get over it, or when I'm feeling hopeless, I can, as an act of my will, make a gratitude list. I can write down 10 things I'm thankful for. And even if they're maybe somewhat trivial, usually I can get through that list. And that act has a way of changing my outlook. And so I can take an action, I can do the right thing, and then the feeling of being better, and it's not a miracle cure, it doesn't solve long-term, sort of a bleak outlook, but it can in the moment help me deal with some of those kinds of things. And I guess the last thing I'd share is that I think I'd heard that Mother Teresa had a very significant spiritual high kind of experience early on. And then for the rest of her life, all those years ministering on the streets of India to the poor and the indigent, she wasn't really actively hearing from God in this kind of emotive way. And she carried on through that. And I think we have her example and the example of others too.
Chris, I was just gonna respond in saying too, again, I just really appreciate what you shared with the group, and it's this reminder for me of how important a community like ours is in situations like this. And like, I want you to feel like you don't carry this alone, and that we care about you and letting us in on praying with you through this. And I just got a really strong reminder of that with what you shared. So
Thank you.
One thing that just came to my mind reflecting on this was I like hearing this personal experience of this reminds me also, as communities, I think we can also communally as a church, and churches can experience kind of similar feelings and movements over time. And I'm thinking of taking some of those similar principles, and even I feel like our community has had those times in our past where things maybe can feel sort of, I don't know, challenging in that sort of way. And I think it's kind of encouraging for me to think of it and applying some of the same things, and thinking of well, maybe it's important then to reach out to other communities and to have a sense of shared experience, or just kind of relying and just sharing that with others, I suppose, like other communities and stuff. So anyways, just kind of a different experience that may be related in some ways.